Life Audio.
The Bible Study Podcast, episode 907. Today, the Bible Study Podcast wraps up its study on the intertestamental period and the book of 1 Maccabees. Welcome to the Bible Study Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. We're going to wrap up this study on 1 Maccabees, but first a word from this sponsor. So we have three more sections here in 1 Maccabees, and then we have a general summary of some things that aren't mentioned that happened right around this time that I want to get to. So remember, in the last episode, Judea has been invaded by the general Sendabius, who is working for Aristarchus VII, who was unfaithful to the Jews. He promised them all sorts of things, and then as soon as he got back to power, took all his promises back. We had the invasion by Sendabius last time in a section called The Defeat of Sendabius, but now we actually get the defeat. John went up from Gazara and reported to his father Simon what Sendabius had done. And Simon called in his two eldest sons, Judas and John, and said to them, "My brothers and I and my father's house have fought the wars of Israel from our youth until this day, and things have prospered in our hands so that we have delivered Israel many times. But now I have grown old, and you by heaven's mercy are mature in years. Take my place and my brothers, and go out and fight for our nation, and may the help that comes from heaven be with you." So John chose out of the country 20,000 warriors and cavalry, and they marched against Sendabius and camped for the night in Modean. Early in the morning they started out and marched into the plain, where a large force of infantry and cavalry were coming to meet them, and a wadi lay between them. Then he and his army lined up against them. He saw that the soldiers were afraid to cross the wadi, so he crossed over first, and when his troops saw him, they crossed over after him. Then he divided the army and placed the cavalry in the center of the infantry, for the cavalry of the enemy were very numerous. They sounded the trumpets, and Sendabius and his army were put to flight. Many of them fell wounded, and the rest fled into the stronghold. At that time Judas, the brother of John, was wounded, but John pursued them until Sendabius reached Kidron, which he had built. They also fled into the towers and were in the fields of Azotus, and John burned it with fire, and about 2,000 of them fell. He then returned to Judah safely. So we get here the passing of the torch, almost literally here, since we're burning places with fire, from Simon, the last of the sons that this book has been about, to his sons, Judas, and especially to John. And John will become the leader in place of Simon, as we're going to see soon. But John basically leads the army this time and defeats this yet another invasion by the Seleucid kingdom here. And this will be the last invasion in this book because we're wrapping this up. And he defeats them. They go, and there's a wadi, a dry riverbed that the people are afraid to cross. He's leading in front. He's crossing this first, dividing his army and sounding the trumpets. And they still have, at this point, when they sound those trumpets, the people know they have been defeated by these Judeans many times, and so they are afraid. And so they are put to flight and defeated yet again. And this is the first of the victories then for John. And then we get murder of Simon and his sons. Now Ptolemy, son of Abubas, had been appointed governor of the plain of Jericho. He had a large store of silver and gold. He was the son-in-law of the high priest. His heart was lifted up. He determined to get control of the country and made treacherous plans against Simon and his sons to do away with them. Now Simon was visiting the towns of the country and attending to their needs. And he went down to Jericho with his sons Mattathias and Judas in the 177th year in the 11th month, which is the month of Shebat. The son of Abubas received them treacherously in the little stronghold called Doc, which he had built. He gave them a great banquet and hid men there. When Simon and his sons were drunk, Ptolemy and his men rose up, took their weapons, rushed in against Simon in the banquet hall, and killed him and his two sons, as well as some of his servants. So he committed an act of great treachery and returned evil for good. So everybody is always trying in this book to get power over somebody else, but usually that's been the rulers of the Seleucid kingdom that has changed hands. I don't know how many times in this book, quite a few times, and not in a peaceful transfer of power as Judea has been having, where it goes from one brother to the next when the first brother is killed, but they've been plotting against each other, and various people have been usurpers. Well, now we get on the Judean side when they finally have success, that somebody here on this side wants it all for themselves. And so we get this plot that kills Simon and two of his sons. And so that generation of sons that have been the focus of this book is now done. John succeeds Simon. Then Ptolemy wrote a report about these things and sent it to the king, asking him to send troops to aid him and turn over to him the towns and the country. He sent other troops to Gazara to do away with John. He sent letters to the captains asking them to come to him so that he might give them silver and gold and gifts. He sent other troops to take possession of Jerusalem and the Temple Hill. But someone ran ahead and reported to John at Gazara that his father and brothers had perished and that he has sent men to kill you also. When he heard this, he was greatly shocked. He seized the men who came to destroy him and killed them, for he found out that they were seeking to destroy him. The rest of the acts of John and his wars, and the brave deeds that he did, and the building of the walls that he completed, and his achievements are written in the annals of his high priesthood, from the time that he became high priest after his father. So two significant things here in this last section of the book. One is that the plot against John fails so that he becomes high priest and he serves for some time. And the second one is he becomes high priest and he serves for some time. And we're not going to study that. We don't have the annals of the high priesthood. You'd think that I could go from First Maccabees into Second Maccabees and it would be a part two, but it's not. It's a retelling of the story. They overlap somewhat. Different authors, different approach. So we're not going to study Second Maccabees. My understanding is that First Maccabees is the better authoritative version of this part of the history. Now, one of the things that's interesting, though, with John is there's some things that happen at this time under John that will affect the story when we get into the New Testament. Specifically, there are three things that we trace to this time period of the high priesthood of John, and they are the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Sanhedrin. So let's do that in the opposite order. So the Sanhedrin, that ruling body that eventually in the New Testament will condemn Jesus to death, or will condemn him and then send him to Pilate to execute him, we don't see that, the Sanhedrin, in the Old Testament. And it seems to have come about in the time period of John here. And if you think about it, we have in Simon and then John the beginning of what's called the Hasmonean kingdom or the Hasmonean dynasty. And I don't know why we don't count the other brothers, but basically these people will rule what is Judea for about 100 years, up until the time of Herod. Herod will be put in as a client king by Rome, and the Hasmoneans will get involved in proxy wars between, as Rome is ending the time period of the Republic and becoming the empire, they'll get caught up in that politics, which we saw the beginning of as they're allied to Rome here with those letters that have been going back and forth. But in this time period, they're going to turn into kings, rather unpopular kings by the time we get to the grandsons, but not so much in the time period of John or of Simon, his father. But even when Herod takes over, he marries someone from this lineage. And so Herod, who becomes king at the time of the birth of Jesus, Herod the Great, has married one of the descendants here of Simon and of John. So, but we notice that in this time period, we have this rule of the high priesthood as king. It will turn into a kingship. So the Sanhedrin gets a little more obvious here, this ruling body that is Pharisees and Sadducees, this ruling body that is religious leaders. How they get so much power is they get so much power because of this time period of First Maccabees. So we think about it, that the whole arc of this story of First Maccabees is that people want to do away with our religion. A lot of people in the country want to go along with that and just become Greek. But we, these brothers and this family, revolt against this foreign influence into our religion. And so that leads to these two groups, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, that come out of this movement of let's go back to faithfulness to God and oppose these outside influences. And so that is the origin of both the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the difference being the Pharisees are not people with power. They're not nobility. They're not the high priests. They're laity, as it were, who are devout. Now, that devotion becomes a little warped by the time we get to Jesus, where he's saying, you're so careful about the law that you've forgotten what it's for. But it comes out of a natural wanting to do things the right way. It's just they get carried away. But that happens during this time period of the Pharisees here, who come out of this movement here in First Maccabees of let's be faithful to God, but faithful to God to the nth degree. And then the Sadducees start as, again, that same sort of thing of John and Simon and their brothers and such, of the priestly party that is trying to be faithful. But one of the things that changes with the Sadducees is they have so much power. This priestly party has so much political power that the Sadducees become more entangled politically. And so the Sadducees will still be more entangled with Rome, for instance, in the New Testament, where the Pharisees are not. And that will affect that they become a little less pure and a little more focused on how do we keep our power. And that's part of what we get in the Sanhedrin, that mixture of the two of them with, isn't it good that someone, Jesus in the case of the New Testament, die for the nation? Basically, they're saying it would be better for Jesus to die than for us to lose our power. So it's one of those power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, that the Sadducees come out of this tradition of we're trying to be faithful to God, that we got power because we were trying to be faithful to God, and now we're just trying to hold on to power. It's one of those sad stories about how movements that start with good intentions can become corrupted and can lose sight of what they're originally trying to do. And I think that's true more of the Sadducees than the Pharisees, although it's true a little bit of the Pharisees, where they lose track of what God wants in getting into the details of the letter of the law, where they have all sorts of rules about what you can do to try and understand what it means to be, for instance, faithful to the Sabbath. So that's one of the reasons that I wanted to get to this time period, is I want to look at this time period because it is this great movement that moves us from the Old Testament to the New Testament, and especially in the founding of those three groups, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and then the combination of them in the Sanhedrin, comes out of this time period of John, according to most scholars. And so that's one of the things that is happening right here, and all of the stage is now set for 100 years from now, when we get Herod the Great and we get the birth of Jesus. And we're going to do that next. We're going to go back and study again the book of Luke, get time to get back into one of the Gospels and look at all of these same groups, but through a lens 100 years later. But we're going to do that starting next week. With that, we're going to end this episode of the Bible Study Podcast and this study of the intertestamental period. If you have any questions, send an email to chris2x@gmail.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at thebiblestudypodcast.com. And thanks so much for listening. I want to take just a second to thank the team at Life Audio for their partnership with us on this podcast. If you go to lifeaudio.com, you'll find dozens of other faith-centered podcasts in their network. They've got shows about prayer, Bible study, parenting, and more.
Life Audio presents Bridges with Monica Schmelter.
That we have an enduring hope that can't be taken away when we are in Christ. And to know that we have that, right? and eternal salvation, because this world can be so busy and so dark that we can forget that. Right? Because sometimes I get caught in the trappings of what's going on in my life this moment. And while I have to recognize that, that's not it.
Continue listening on lifeaudio.com or wherever you find your podcast.